So what is a functional programming? A function are as the unit of work and they are executed, they start and they finish. In simple terms, you can say that a functional programming means very small amount of work need to be done by a particular function. It's a part of a single responsibility principle. A function should be very small so that it will not take much amount of time to execute. This is the core concept of a functional programming. So whenever you are working with a functional programming, you have to make sure that a function should have a unit of work that is a small work. A function can be executed, they can start, they can finish depending upon the different criteria. And a function can have an input and output. They can accept an input parameter and they can return an output value. Now let's discuss what are the best practices for a functional programming. A functional programming should do one thing, which means it should follow the single responsibility principle. A function should be only do only a one thing. We cannot collate multiple implementation into a single function. And if as a business requirement, it is required to create a multiple function, in that case, you have to create a multiple small functions. A function should finish as quickly as possible. This is very much important if you talk about a functional programming. A function should finish as soon as they can. In simple terms, you can say if a function is taking a more than expected time frame, then that is not good. And the third is a function should be idempotent. What do you mean by idempotent at the first place? So whenever you create a function, let's say a web API, you just call that web API. And now if you're calling that web API multiple times with the same parameter, then if it is an idempotent, then it automatically cache the score records or response and it will not hit the server again and again. This will definitely save your bandwidth because you are not hitting a server again and again. You are just creating a first call, you are pulling the relevant record, and then you're serving from that record. This functionality is called as idempotent. And if you talk about a functional programming, a function should be idempotent. Now you may argue like this is not possible every time. That's true. This is not possible every time, but wherever it's possible, we should implement in that way only. Now let's move to the next topic, that is an Azure Functions. So what exactly is an Azure Function? Azure Function is based on a serverless architecture and it is the evolution of a web job. We can develop an Azure Function in different languages like C#, Node, Java, Python, etc. It is easy to schedule event-driven tasks across services, and we can simply say that we can mix a code and event data to create an Azure function. What exactly is an Azure function? An Azure function is a part of a serverless architecture, and it's an evolution of a web job. You can simply say that the example that we discussed about creating a web API, that can be done with the help of an Azure function, and Azure function exposes an API endpoints only. So you can simply say that an Azure function need not require any server to be deployed. Everything is taken care by the Azure ecosystem. We can develop Azure function in multiple languages. Let's say C#, Node, Java, Python. It totally depend upon your command on that particular language. And an Azure function is an event-driven task. So when we say event-driven, it could be triggered automatically based on a timer. It could be triggered automatically based on a storage account. It could be triggered automatically based on a service bus. We will understand this in detail in the upcoming slide. The thing is that there is no need to call an Azure function. It can be triggered automatically, and that's why it is called as an event driven across multiple Azure services. Now let's discuss about the analogy or the architecture that can be contribute as a part of Azure function. This is just a basic overview. We'll discuss about this architecture in the upcoming slide. But as of now, you can say that an Azure function is just an app service. And on top of that, we have web jobs, we have language runtime. The language runtime simply means the language that you choose. So suppose you have chosen a C++, sorry, C#. In that case, it would be having a C# language runtime. And on top of that, we have a function code and a configuration. A function code simply means a code that an Azure function consists of or it's supposed to perform, and it includes certain configuration that are used by it. This technology or these terms is called an Azure function, where it is the based of an serverless architecture, and it can perform a different event-driven task, and it is exposed an HTTP endpoint. Again, you can say that an Azure function can be easily integrated with logic apps. We have discussed what exactly is logic app in the previous sessions, and we can bring our own dependencies with Azure function like NuGet or npm, and NuGet and npm can be used in Azure function. And finally, you can say it supports an automated and dynamic scaling. So with the help of Azure function, you can automatically scale your application depending upon your workload. If you say is that, okay, I'm getting enough traffic right now and I need to increase my processing power, Azure function is capable of doing this. It can scale automatically and it can scale dynamically as well. This is all about an Azure function. In the next slide, we'll discuss about Azure function architecture. In an interview, it can be asked, like, explain the architecture of an Azure function. We can simply say is that an Azure function architecture is divided into following category. At the very base level, we do have something called as app services dynamic runtime. It include hosting, continuous integration, deployment slots, remote debugging, etc. Everything that belongs to an infra point that relies on here. Then we do have something called as web jobs core and web job extension. The web job core depend upon the programming model and it provides some common abstraction whereas the web job extension deals with triggers, inputs, and output binding. We discussed that we can trigger Azure function automatically with the help of certain event. Let's say I push some file into my storage account, and once that is pushed, after it, I want to trigger my Azure function. I can do this. Let's say I want to trigger an Azure function by sending some message into a service bus message queue. If I sends or if I saves any message into a queue, I want to trigger an Azure function, I can do this. This can be done with the help of a web job. We do have something called as web core as well, which basically consists of a programming model or which programming languages you choose. That would be part of a web job core. Then we have something called as web job script runtime, and it simply says about the language abstraction. So let's say you use C Sharp, Node.js, Java, Python, that comes into a language runtime over here, and this is relying on the web job scripts runtime because a script is something which would be triggered automatically. On top of that, we have called a code and config. Code simply means an Azure function exactly functionality which is required as a code which it need to be performed. And when you talk about config, it's basically a JSON file which have a different configuration of an Azure function. A configuration can be anything. It could provide a different configuration that is used by an Azure function. So in simple terms, you can say that Azure function architecture is divided into following category: an app service dynamic runtime, then we have web jobs core and web job extension, then we have web job script runtime, a language runtime, and a code and a config. This is all about an Azure function architecture. Now let's move to the next slide or the next question, where Azure function can be used. It can be asked in a different way, like what is the practical use case of an Azure function? So the practical use case of an Azure function can be, it can be used for a scheduled data processing, cleaning up and archiving task. As discussed, it can be used for a scheduled task. Like if you want to clean up into a storage account, you can write an Azure function. You want to archive some of the files that are available in a storage account, you can use Azure function. It can be also used as a serverless web app SPA backend via HTTP. Suppose you are creating an application or a single page application with the help of front-end framework like Angular or React. This Azure function can be act as a web API call or a backend call that is exposed via HTTP, that is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And Azure function can be used as a backend for a mobile application as well. Since they are exposed as a web API, they can be used as a web app or as an application for a mobile app backend. It can be also used for a real time or an Internet of Thing, that is IoT event processing. We know what exactly is IoT devices. So they just collect data and they send data to some third party server so that can process it. And Azure Function is well suited for an IoT event processing as well. So as soon as the IoT devices get an event, it just post it into the upcoming to the server, and further it can be processed for multiple things. And Azure Function can also be used for a service event-based processing, that is responding to a new queue message. We discuss about a service bus. So Azure Function can be used for an responding to a new messages that comes into a queue into an Azure service bus. You can simply say that these are the common scenarios or the use cases of an Azure functions. What are the limitations of Azure function? Now let's discuss the limitations that could be happen within Azure function. The first limitation of an Azure function is a lack of troubleshooting ways. Since we do not have any defined way to troubleshoot Azure function, sometimes it becomes very much difficult when we got an issue in production environment, and it becomes difficult to troubleshoot the Azure function. The second is third party API trust. Serverless computing relies heavily on the third party services, and we need to trust the response and security of these services. Whatsoever services are sending us a response, we need to rely on them, and we need to be trust them that the security mechanism that they are using is as up to date. The third limitation of an Azure function could be a vendor locking. And as an Azure function relies on third party services, and if a third party service is not giving a response in an estimated time frame, in that case, there might be a delay in the response of an original Azure function, which cannot be further processed. So this vendor locking can also be considered as one of the limitation of an Azure function. The fourth limitation could be stated as an over complex architecture. Sometimes when we start creating an Azure function, we ended up by creating a too many functions, and if we tend to do so, then it became difficult to perform some kind of analysis on that part because of its complex architecture. It became difficult to manage as well because of its complex architecture. And the last limitation of an Azure function could be considered as a latency. Since you are using in a serverless computing, and if you're using consumption plan, so there would be some initial boot up time whenever the first request comes into the Azure function. That might cause some latency. Also, an Azure function can be interacted with multiple third-party APIs, and if there is some delay in the response of third-party API, then again we can have some latency that might impact the SLAs. These are some of the limitations of an Azure function. Now let's move to our next topic, that is what is the execution time limit for an Azure function. This could be asked in a different way as well, and they can ask a question like, what is the default time limit of an Azure function? The default time limit of an Azure function is 5 minutes under the consumption plan, and this could be increased to 10 minutes through the changes in host.json file. What does it exactly mean? It simply means that whenever you trigger an Azure function, your Azure function should give a response to client in a duration of 5 minutes. So if it will take more than 5 minutes, then Azure will definitely and directly disable the function over there. If execution time of an Azure function can be increased to 10 minutes under consumption plan, and that could be done through the host.json file. The common interview question that can be asked under this slide is, what is the default time limit of an Azure function in consumption plan? And the answer is 5 minutes. What are the advantages of consumption plan over app service plan? Now, this is something which can be asked in multiple interviews, and this is not about an Azure function. This is about an app service plan in general, and about an architecture or the requirement of Azure in general. It might be asked in a different way as well, like what do you prefer, a consumption plan or an app service plan? So let's discuss the advantages of consumption plan over the app service plan. The first advantage is that Azure function under the consumption plan will only charge for the user's time with the automatic scaling to meet in demand. We have already studied in the previous slide that under the consumption plan, we have to pay per second basis. So whatsoever time we are using Azure function, we have to pay for that time frame only, and that also meet an automatic scaling. So suppose if your Azure function is struggling to serve your customer, and if you have enabled automatic scaling, Then there would be a couple of other instances would be created in an Azure function automatically, and they will soon be ready to serve your customer. The function that hosted on an app service plan cost less if they are used for an occasional service. In simple terms, you can say that if a proper plan is chosen, that is a app service, so it could be used. A consumption plan could be cost less if they are only using occasional services. So let's say in an app service plan you have to pay for, let's say, $50 per month, and in a consumption plan, let's say if you have to pay a $1 per request. So if you know that in a particular month you are only hitting an Azure function for 20 times, then you have to pay only a $20 instead of as compared to $50 if you choose an app service plan. So that's why it's very much important for you to understand your need before choosing the consumption plan or the app service plan in Azure function. If a consumption plan is something which you can use if you are having a less usage of an Azure function. What are the difference between a web job and an Azure function? Now, again, as we told that Azure function is an evolution of a web job, so it can be asked by an interviewer like, what is the difference between an Azure function and a web job or Azure web job? Both Azure Function and Azure Web Job are used for background processing. So this is a similarity between both of them, and both of them are used for doing some background tasks. The difference is that a web job are designed to run continuously as a part of app service plan, while as the Azure function are event-driven serverless compute. When you use a web job, that would be run continuously as a part of app service plan. There would be no drop or no downtime of this web job, whereas the Azure function are event driven. Now, what exactly is event driven? We have already understood this in the previous slides, and we will again discuss this in next slide as well. But as a part of this implementation or this slide, Azure function are event driven, and they are different from web job because a web job runs continuously, whereas Azure function run on an event driven basis whenever something happens on particular queue or storage account. It is also a part of serverless compute that execute code in response of event of triggers. So this is the functionality of an event driven application, and they respond to a particular event, and that's why we can say that Azure function is different from web job. Which programming language does function support? Azure Function supports a different kind of programming language, which includes C Sharp, JavaScript, F Sharp, Java, and Python. You can create your Azure function using C Sharp. You can create it using Python. You can create your function using JavaScript as well. So if you're only proficient in a front-end development using JavaScript, you can create your Azure function using JavaScript as well. But from an interview perspective, you can simply say is that Azure function is supported by these programming languages. When should you use Azure Function on Azure Container apps? Running function on a container app preview is a good fit for multi-type microservices architecture in a centralized environment. It gives us a consistent network observability and billing configuration. So you can simply call the Azure function inside the Azure container, and this could be best suited in case of a multi-type microservices where you have to manage everything from the centralized environment. So in simple terms, you can say that if you're working on microservices, then in that case, and if you're using containers app, in that case, you can use Azure function on the Azure container app. Now let's move to our next topic, that is Azure function use cases and plans. So where are Azure functions can be used? Over here, it can be asked like, what are the practical use cases of Azure function? The practical use case of Azure function is number one, serverless API with Node.js or Microsoft.NET. We already discussed that an Azure function can be used to create a serverless APIs, and we can create a single page application to call our Azure function. It can also be used for a serverless web application for static websites and single page application. Again, the same thing that we want to create a web application to serve the backend part, we can use an Azure function. Azure function can be used in a microservices for an event-driven scenario. So we can create different triggers, a blob trigger, a queue trigger, or a service or a storage account trigger. And based on those triggers, we can create an Azure function for an event-driven scenarios. And Azure function is also a best suited for machine learning workflow in case of serverless architecture. Azure Function can also be used for data processing pipeline for the files and real-time databases. So we can create a pipeline using Data Factory, and that Data Factory pipeline can be used inside an Azure Function can be used inside a Data Factory pipeline. It could be also used to trigger an ADF pipeline whenever something happens on the storage account. And finally, you can say is that it can be also used in a hybrid resource management environment. Apart from these use cases, you can definitely learn about the more use cases of Azure Function by following to this website that is provided by Microsoft. Now, let's move to the next question, that is, give an example of an scheduled data processing using Azure Function. So what exactly mean by an scheduled data processing? When you talk about scheduled processing, it simply means that a certain function or certain thing that run at particular interval. So in this diagram, you can say that we have enabled a timer trigger, which will invoke a Azure function at every 15 minutes. So in every 15 minutes, a Azure function would be triggered. It will clean the data and will insert a cleaned and sanitized data into a clean table. You can simply say that this is one of the example which we can say a scheduled data processing can be done using Azure function, and timer trigger would be used for those scenario. Give an example of a real-time event processing using Azure function. The real-time event processing could be the one that we're discussing so far, that is file adding to a blob storage. So let's say whenever you add a file into a blob storage, we can apply a blob trigger on an Azure function. And as soon as a file is added into a blob storage, a Azure function can kicks in, and it can convert a CSV file into a data rows, and then it can be used to display a report on the Power BI. So you can say that this end-to-end process is an example of a real-time event processing on an Azure function. This can be also used to trigger an ADF pipeline, as we discussed in the previous slide. Suppose if a file is added into a blob storage, then an Azure function could be there to trigger an ADF pipeline. And ADF stands for Azure Data Factory, and it's an online version of SSIS. So once we trigger this, it could be used to perform different function. We can sanitize data, we can apply different kind of joins, and then we can store data into data warehouse, which could be used for analytics and Power BI purpose. So this is one of the another use case of an Azure function where we can provide a real-time event data processing. It give an example of an serverless working using an Azure function. Now, what exactly it means? So in this question, we can simply say is that how a serverless computing can be worked in Azure function, and this could be done with the help of a web page calls webhook. So whenever you load a website, a webhook could be there, and that can call an Azure function, and based on the user profile, it can fetch the data from a database, and it can display in front of user. This is a typical example of having a serverless working of an Azure function. Now let's move to a next question, that is given example of a serverless mobile backend using an Azure function. How Azure function can be used for processing a mobile backend? The answer is simple. So let's say you took a photo from a mobile device and you call a webhook. The webhook stores or call a Azure function, and that stores data into a blob storage. And again, from the blob storage, we use the blob trigger that will read the data from the blob, and then it produce the scale images. This is one of the use case of using a mobile backend using an Azure function, where a couple of Azure functions can be used, one for storing data into a blob storage, another for processing the data that is stored in the blob storage. This is a real-time example of a mobile backend use function. What are Azure function plans? Now, this is something which is again an important question from an interview perspective, because interviewer can be asked like what are the different plans of an Azure function. The Azure function can be categorized into multiple plans. The first plan is an app service plan. The second plan is consumption plan. And the third plan includes a premium plan. So let's discuss each one by one. When you talk about app service plan, it simply relies on the existing app service plan, and it would be having a predictable monthly cost. So as you know that if you're using an app service plan, you have not supposed to pay on pay per use basis. You will be charged a fixed amount on every month. Let's say $50 in this case. So you have to pay a $50 every month if you are using an app service plan. If you are going with a consumption plan, you have to pay for what much amount of resources you are using as an Azure function on per second basis. So a consumption plan gives some kind of free request every month, and once that is done, that it will charge you according to the pricing model, and it will charge you based on the million request of compute or how many resources you can utilize. And the third is a premium plan, which is the more elite version of a plan. It can simply say that it's built on a per second basis on the number of vCPUs and GBs of your premium function consume. So you just remember that since it is a serverless computing, is still there are sub servers which are managing these or hosting these functions, and the quality and the output response time of those functions depend upon the CPU cores and the memory that your server is provisioned. So in case of premium plan, you have to pay for the amount of virtual CPU or CPU cores and the memory that basically has the particular machine on which your Azure functions are hosted. Our next question is Azure Function Consumption Plan Pricing. So let's discuss what exactly is the pricing model of an Azure function in case of an consumption plan. An Azure function consumption plan is built on per second resource consumption and execution. A consumption plan pricing includes a monthly free grant of 1 million execution and 4 lakh GBs of resource consumption per subscription in an pay as you go pricing across all function app in subscription. So you can say that in a subscription, if you have 10 Azure functions, then all the 10 Azure function in combined will get a 1 million executions of a free grant per month. Post 1 million execution, so whenever you cross this limit, you will be charged about rupees 13.220 per million execution. The execution time also would be 0.001058 per GB per second. The Azure Function Consumption Plan pricing also creates a storage account by default with each function app, and the storage account is not included in the free grant. You have to pay an extra amount of money for the storage account. The standard storage rates and networking charges are applied as applicable in case of an storage account of an Azure function. Now let's move to the next topic, that is Azure Function Premium Plan pricing. The Azure Function Premium Plan provides some features and scaling mechanism as used in the consumption plan. So whatsoever features and scaling mechanism are available in the consumption plan, the same features and scaling mechanism are also applicable in the Azure Function Premium Plan pricing. The only difference is that in the Azure Function Premium Plan, there is no cold start and it would be having an enhanced performance and VNet access as compared to a consumption plan. So in consumption plan, there would be no VNet access, whereas in an Azure Function Premium plan, there would be a virtual network access, and the performance of an Azure Function Premium plan pricing is more as compared to an Azure Function Consumption plan. Also, there would be no cold start in case of an Azure Function Premium plan pricing. So a question might be asked like, what do you mean by a cold start in case of an Azure function? So let's say you are not using an Azure function for a couple of hours, and as soon as you start using it, the first call would be a delayed call because at that time, Microsoft is doing a couple of things behind the scenes to run your Azure function. That issue exists in a consumption plan pricing model, but that issue does not exist in case of an Azure function premium plan pricing. Azure function premium plan pricing billing is based on number of cores and memory allocated across each instances. There is no execution charge with the premium plan, consumption plan, or premium plan pricing model of an Azure function. There are some default categories as well, which you need to take care whenever you're dealing with an Azure function. So in a consumption plan, the default timeout of an Azure function is 5 minutes. This simply means that if you have not configured it manually, then it is recommended that your function execution should be completed into a 5 minute. If you go beyond than that, then the execution of a function will be suspended. This default limit can be increased to up to 10 minutes in case of a consumption plan by making a configuration in the host file. Similarly, in the case of premium plan, the default timeout is 30 minutes, whereas the maximum timeout is 60 minutes. And in case of an app service plan, the default timeout is 30 minutes and there is no maximum limit in an app service plan. This is something which you need to remember and might be asked in an interview. An interviewer might ask like, what is the default timeout of an Azure function in case of a consumption plan? So the answer is 5 minutes. Now let's move to the next topic, that is Azure function triggers and bindings. So what are triggers and bindings in an Azure function? A triggers can cause a function to run. A function must have exactly one trigger and its associated data. A binding enables a function to connect with another resources. A binding may be an input binding, an output binding, or both. Data from binding is provided to a function as a parameter, and bindings are optional, and function might have one or multiple input and output binding. So there are a couple of questions which can be asked around triggers and binding concept in an Azure function. But first of all, let's discuss what do you mean by triggers and what do you mean by binding. So triggers basically cause a function to run, and there are different type of triggers available in Azure function. It could be a blob trigger, an HTTP trigger, or a timer trigger. So let's say if you're talking about a blob trigger, as soon as our data is uploaded into a blob storage, we can trigger or we can align a trigger to an Azure function so that it will start executing. So with the data uploadation process on the blob storage, Azure function will be triggered and it can perform the relevant actions. Azure function have exactly one trigger. Now this is very important from an interview perspective. They might ask like how many triggers are associated with an Azure function. The answer is only one. A single trigger can be associated with a single Azure function. A binding is enables a function to connect with another resources. So let's say if you want to do a workflow, in that case, a binding is useful. A binding may be an input binding, an output binding, or both. Bindings are optional, whereas triggers are not optional. So again, this is something which can be asked in an interview. An interviewer might be asked like, is Azure Functions bindings are mandatory? The answer is no. And a function can have one or multiple input and output binding, whereas a function can have only one trigger. So these are some of the common differences that you have to be learned about a concept of an Azure function bindings and triggers. The, in order to summarize this slide, we can simply say is that Azure function have only one binding, where only one triggers, where it can have a multiple binding. Triggers are mandatory, whereas bindings are optional. Now let's discuss the next question, that what are the services have triggers and binding supports in an Azure function. So you can see in this scenario that a triggers and binding can be used to create a proper workflow. And as recommendation, it is advised that you should stop using hard coding access of other services like Blob Storage and Cosmos DBs across triggers and binding in Azure function, because the connection strings and other values might vary from an environment to environment. So avoid doing a hard coding access of it. And as discussed in the last slide, triggers are something which are used to function to run, and bindings are declaration that connect the function to another resource. So let's discuss with the help of an example. In this, you can say that a new queue message arrives when which runs a function to write another queue. So we can create a queue trigger, and based on this queue trigger, we can write data to another queue. So in this scenario, the queue is the trigger and the queue is the output binding. In the second scenario, we can create a scheduled job that reads data from a blob storage and creates a new Cosmos DB content. So since this is a scheduled job, then it would be a timer trigger and it will run at a proper interval. It will read data from a blob storage. So in that case, the input binding is the blob storage, and it writes data into a new Cosmos DB document. Then in that case, the output binding is a Cosmos DB document. Similarly, if we talk about this scenario, the input trigger or the trigger is an event grid. So as soon as a data is there in an event grid, it reads the message or data from a blob storage and are used to send an email using a send grid. So it simply says that you can combine multiple Azure function, or you can have a multiple bindings in an Azure function which can be used to perform a different workflow depending upon your business use case. How can you trigger the execution of a function? This can be asked in a different way as well, like what are different type of triggers available in an Azure function. The different triggers are HTTP trigger, blob trigger, queue trigger, timer trigger. There are the couple of examples over here. So if you talk about an HTTP trigger, it simply means that it will cause an Azure functions to run as soon as an HTTP request is created. In case of blob trigger as well, it will run an Azure function whenever a data is inserted into a blob storage. Similarly, if you talk about queue trigger, the Azure function will trigger automatically as soon as something is inserted into an service bus queue, and the timer trigger can be used to create a scheduled cron job. So in simple terms, you can say that when you combine a code plus some kind of events and data, then it contributes to an creation of an Azure function. So this is all about an Azure function. Let's move to our next topic, that is a durable function. So what exactly are durable functions in case of an Azure function? A Azure function is a stateless function, which simply means that you can create an Azure function, or you can create multiple Azure function, but each and every Azure function would be a stateless, and the second Azure function will not remember the state of your first Azure function. So in order to solve this issue, there is something called as a durable function, which is an extension of an Azure function that enables us to write a stateful function in a serverless compute environment. It can be also used to define a workflow in code using an orchestrator function. So with this diagram, you can see that there would be an orchestrator and it can call multiple Azure functions simultaneously. So in simple terms, you can say a durable function are those functions which can remember states across the different functions access of an Azure function, even on a serverless compute environment. Our next question is, what are durable function concepts? A durable function can be divided into three different categories. The first one is starter function, the second is orchestrator function, and the third is an activity function. So when you talk about a starter function, it simply says it consists of an trigger orchestrator function which orchestrate or initiates the entire durable function concept. In the orchestrator function, we define few categories. We define the workflow, we invoke different activity function, and we sleep the function during inactivity. And the activity function perform a single step in a workflow, and it also can receive and return a data. So let's understand this with the help of an example. Let's say this is our starter function, the starter function, and this is my orchestrator function in an Azure function. And post that, I can have a different activity function 1, 2, and 3. It is the role, this starter function will orchestrate the Azure durable function concept, and this orchestrator function responsibility is to call the specific activity function depending upon the workflow. And it can be, and these activity function is capable of sending and receiving data. So this is how our durable function concepts work in an Azure. There are a couple of different patterns available in an Azure durable function, which can be found on an Azure documentation online. Now let's move to the next question, that is, can you have an stateful function in Azure? The answer is yes, we can have a stateful function in Azure, and we can do this with the help of durable function. Durable function is an advanced extension of function, and it allows stateful coordination problem in a serverless application. The next question is a cron expression. So what do you mean by a cron expression? A cron expression decides the frequency of a code execution, and it is composed of 6 fields. The first field is called as second, the second field is called as minute, the third field is called as hour, the fourth is called as day, the fifth is month, and sixth is a day of the week. So whenever you are trying to write down a cron expression, you have to write down in this way only. And with the help of cron expression, you can decide the frequency of any code execution. Let's say if I want to run my Azure function at an interval of 15 minutes on daily basis. So what I can do, I can just write down my cron expression like this. Let's reduce the analogy of cron expression by this with the help of the above formula. So as we discussed, the first part of an expression is a second, that is 0 in this case. The second part is minute, that is 15 in this case. The third part is hour. Star means every hour, day means every day, month means every month, and day of the week means every day of the week. This simply means that if I choose this cron expression, I am asking to run this and every 15 minutes. On a similar note, if you want to run it every hour, then you have to just write everything in the star and you can have second and minute as 00. So by entering a star, it simply means that it will run on every hour. If you want something that to be run from every hour from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., you can accordingly put it down the different areas. So this hyphen is used to categorize the different time frame. So in this case, you can simply say that second is 0, minute is 0, and then hour belongs to 9 to 17, which means a 9 a.m. to 17 p.m., and that is a 5 p.m. So the cron expression is very much important in any kind of triggers in which it, with the help of cron expression, we can simply decide that what is the frequency of our code execution in case of an Azure function. So this is it all about the cron expression and Azure function. Do let us know if you have any questions on this topic. Thanks.